Warning, censorship. Warning, censorship.
It looked at the effects of hydroxychloroquine preventatively and treatment-wise on these cells when exposed to the very close relative of SARS-CoV-2, which is SARS-CoV-1. And the results were dramatic. Like, you seldom read a research paper, scientific research paper with such dramatic results where you say, wow. So the idea that there was, and that was with chloroquine, a very close relative of hydroxychloroquine. So it was very strange that the doctor who was the head of the NIH, when it did that research, seemed shocked that anyone would be talking about that family of medications.
Well, folks, last year, hydroxychloroquine suddenly became a household word, given that several prominent figures, including former President Donald Trump, praised this drug as a means of treating COVID-19. But there were no shortage of naysayers stating that the drug is not an effective solution when it comes to COVID-19. However, in 2020 hindsight, did hydroxychloroquine get a bum rap? My guest is veteran Dr. Mark Trozzi, and he seems to think that is the case. So, Dr. Trozzi, what is the deal with this drug? I mean, was it given the proper media coverage and even medical and scientific coverage it deserved when it first entered the lexicon for so many people almost a year ago?
Well, that's a good question. Hydroxychloroquine is a very interesting thing. Hydroxychloroquine has been around for 65 years. It's an old drug. Many countries in the world you can buy it over the counter. Actually, the countries where you can buy it over the counter had the much lower death rates than the ones where you can't.
Really?
Sub-Saharan Africa, very poor countries, low death rates. If you go back, for instance, you mentioned when President Trump had mentioned it. But really, who was mentioning it? He was just repeating there were doctors who were reporting that it was working. And there was, for instance, a doctor in a region outside New York there who had many patients who actually were sick with COVID at the beginning of this, back when there was a lot of cases.
And of course, back when the governor of New York was sending COVID-19 cases into old folks' homes, virtually the very worst thing you could possibly do. But continue.
Well, he did his part. It's evil to imagine that
Yeah.
that's doing your job. But so there were doctors coming out and saying, hey, I've been using hydroxychloroquine, zinc, and azithromycin cocktail. Yeah. And they were describing patients, instead of them going from sick to intubated, that they would notice them make a significant turnaround within a dozen hours, and often going home and just being treated home. And we're not talking about a lot of medicine. We're talking about 5 days of pills. One of them being a mineral, the other one being a 65-year-old safe drug, and the other one being a safe and frequently used antibiotic that a lot of people have had. Something that struck me very interesting at that time is when President Trump came out and said, hey, I'm hearing a lot of doctors saying hydroxychloroquine helps, so that's good to know there's something, you know. I heard an interview, and I can't quote him exactly, with Dr. Fauci, where it seemed to me he was saying, oh, I don't know what he's talking about. There isn't evidence for that. Well, that's very interesting, because in 2005, the NIH did a study. Now, this was in vitro, like a study in the lab using primate cells. And it looked at the effects of hydroxychloroquine preventatively and treatment-wise on these cells when exposed to the very close relative of SARS-CoV-2, which is SARS-CoV-1. And the results were dramatic. Like, you seldom read a research paper, a scientific research paper with such dramatic results where you say, wow. So the idea that there was, and that was with chloroquine, a very close relative of hydroxychloroquine. So it was very strange that the doctor who was the head of the NIH, when it did that research, seemed shocked that anyone would be talking about that family of medications. The other thing that's interesting is, as there were many countries in the world that had a protocol. They had a protocol. Now, it wasn't that everyone who got sick with COVID should take it, because keep in mind, about 80% of people that caught COVID when it was available had little symptoms or a mild illness. Yeah. And then you get into the other 20% where, about 19+% of them got sick and would generally recover. And then you have a very small portion, like, much less than 1%, that potentially die and require that level of care. So in these countries, they had a protocol, which was, because we know comorbidities is important. In other words, if somebody's diabetic, obese, hypertensive, have lung disease from smoking, cardiac disease, they're more likely to get very sick with anything.
Correct.
Right? So that group of people who were older, over 60 or over 65, depends where you were, and if people got short of breath, that was recognized as if, even if you're 30 years old and you don't have comorbidities, if you caught COVID, and you got short of breath, that was used as a criteria. And these people would be given zinc, hydroxychloroquine, and azithromycin. So one question is, well, what's the science behind this? And I think it'd be good for people to realize this isn't just, magic chalk pills.
Yeah.
Inside of the human cells, remember we spoke before about the messenger RNA virus.
Yes.
COVID is a messenger RNA virus. So when it invades a cell and it activates, one of the first things it has to do is make copies of its genetic material, of its messenger RNA. And in order to do that, one of the key steps is it has to use an enzyme called replicase. It has multiple names, but replicase is a good name for it because it replicates.
Yeah.
Replicase is inhibited by zinc. That's why I think people take zinc lozenges for viral sore throats. There's science behind it.
Yeah.
But here's the trick. No matter how much zinc tablets I take, I can only get my intracellular level. The level of zinc in my cells won't get that high unless I have something to cause it to go in. And this is ioform type molecules. So for zinc, hydroxychloroquine or chloroquine or quinine, they're all ioform molecules. So what that means is the zinc that I'm taking, suddenly more of it can go into the cells. So now inside the human cells, you have high levels of zinc, and those high levels of zinc interfere with the replicase enzyme, which makes it much harder for the virus to replicate. There are two other mechanisms we know how hydroxychloroquine works that affect the ability of it to get into the cell in the first place.
So, Doctor, you said off camera that hydroxychloroquine, it is relatively cheap, very cheap.
Yeah.
That's good for society at large, but maybe that's not so good if you're a pharmaceutical company and you want to peddle a much higher price vaccine. Is that part of the process behind the scenes in terms of denouncing this drug?
I sure think so. I mean, money and power. Imagine if we looked at this COVID differently. Imagine if I said to you, let's say we went back, because diseases come and go. There's a thing called herd immunity. That's why like, oh, there's a cold going around, and then there's another cold going around. Yeah. Now, I'm not denying that this particular cold may have been cooked in a lab. I don't know. But if there was a cold going around, and I said to you, well, listen, there's an 80% chance you may, if you catch it before there's herd immunity, you're not going to be very sick, or you might not be sick at all. And there's a 90% chance plus that you're going to get sick, but you'll get better. But there's a small chance you could get really sick and die from this. But if that was the case, you could go and pick up some hydroxychloroquine, zinc, and azithromycin and reduce the risk a lot. I don't think you'd have a terrified population ready to take experimental injections, ready to wear muzzles or masks or whatever you want to call them, ready to be social isolated, ready to leave their elders alone, locked up in nursing homes to die. You wouldn't have that.
Well, Dr. Trozzi, we got to wrap it here. It sounds like to me this was a missed opportunity in terms of this drug being used.
May I mention one thing?
Yes.
Because a lot of the things we talk about, we get into them briefly. I have put up a website.
That's right.
Called drtrozzi.com, so just drtrozzi.com. And there you can go into a lot more details. There's articles about hydroxychloroquine and different things, for instance. So I'm trying to help disseminate some information.
drtrozzi.com. And there you have it, folks. I think maybe another nail in the coffin of hydroxychloroquine was the fact that the biggest booster going back a year ago was President Donald Trump. So maybe the real virus here, it's not the Wuhan virus, maybe it was Trump derangement syndrome. If you have had your charter rights trampled on in the name of the Wuhan virus, please reach out to us at fightthefines.com. That's fightthefines.com. Let us know about your case. If we think it has merit, we'll get you in touch with a top-notch criminal lawyer and we shall crowdfund your legal fees.